So when I found myself in the area of Homeland Security, which was driven by actually watching 9/11, watching the Pentagon burn across the river from the top of one of the Washington's buildings, we created this magazine, Homeland Security Today, to cover that topic. We've been doing it since May 2004. Our May issue, the next one coming up, will mark our 7th year in this field. And throughout, we have always paid attention to agriculture and to agroterrorism. This was our May 2000 cover. At that time we were HS Today, and then we expanded the name. But, you know, even though I do come from an urban background, my late father-in-law had a ranch out in Durango, Colorado, and raised cattle. And our publisher lives on a farm out in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where she raises alpacas. So I have some passing familiarity with animal agriculture. But when we started the magazine and we started looking into the hazards that face our food supply, I became quite consciously aware of just what is out there and what measures need to be taken to preserve that. This was one issue. We did another story much later on, Safer Home on the Range, about the vaccine stockpiles. And I've been asked to talk about terrorism against agriculture, and especially against animal agriculture. And I think the best way to do this is to proceed with looking back a little bit on the history of agroterrorism, because there is some serious history here. Not all of it has to do with animals, but if you go back to the opening of the 20th century in World War I, there was a determined program by the Germans to kill the horses and the mules and donkeys that were being shipped to the Allies. And it was pretty extensive. It was in Romania, Spain, Norway, Argentina, the United States. What they would do is rub the muzzles of these animals with glanders and anthrax and try to stop them from getting to the Allied armies. And remember that horses and mules were a strategic asset. The armies were not as mechanized as they are now. It didn't work very well, by the way. And ultimately, you know, the war came to an end. By the way, if you look in that photograph, you'll see that the horse is wearing a gas mask as well, because they did fit them with gas masks because they were working in a chemical environment. But this is probably the largest, the most organized, and the most determined terrorism may not be the right word, but animal sabotage program that was ever conducted. Then when you get to World War II, Japan had a very active biological program. This one didn't work all that well either. They used it against the Soviet Union and Mongolia. And remember that the Soviet Union was fighting with Japan prior to Pearl Harbor. In fact, they defeated the Japanese, which made them change their strategy, and that ultimately led to their attack on the American fleet. But they used anthrax, rinderpest. They also used biological agents against Chinese crops, because remember, they were attempting to conquer China as well. And they had a little earlier experience with this in 1931, when there was a League of Nations delegation that came to Manchuria, or Manchukuo, as the Japanese used to call it, to investigate what was going on there. And they tried to poison the delegation, poison their fruit and so forth. And that didn't work either. Tried to give them cholera. Now, there's two instances of more recent terrorism, and this is agroterrorism. It's not against livestock, but it was against fruit. Now, in 1979, what happened was a family in Amsterdam had an Israeli orange, a Jaffa orange. They cut it open, and they see these silver globules in it. Well, they investigated, and it turned out it had been injected with mercury. And when an investigation was conducted, they found that fruit that had been distributed in Europe had been injected with this mercury. This was an attempt by this Arab Revolutionary Council to disrupt Israeli trade. When the Israelis investigated, they found that the point of sabotage was not in Israel, it was in Europe. So somebody at the European distribution point had poisoned this fruit. Well, the Israelis obviously were upset, but equally upset were Arab countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Algiers, all of whom exported oranges to Europe. And so their trade was affected. Spain was affected, and the Europeans were just livid over this. And what this showed, more than the damage itself, which wasn't great, and people did not get sick from this, was the unpredictability of agroterrorism. Because you can poison fruit, you can poison livestock, but you don't know what the exact effects are going to be. What happened here was the PLO, which was really the group that was orchestrating this, got everybody mad at them. The Europeans were mad at them. The other Arabs were mad at them. They had no benefit from this. They disrupted some Israeli trade. They may have hurt some Israeli growers, but they didn't achieve their larger political objective. And so there has not been a case of agroterrorism against Israel ever since. It is a blunt instrument that does not actually work very well when you look at it from a terrorist perspective. Now, in 1989, in Chile, there was another instance, and in this case, what happened was there were phone calls to the American consulate, the American embassy, the State Department in the United States, saying that Chilean fruit had been poisoned. They didn't say which fruit, but Chilean fruit. And the motivation for this was, remember at that time Chile was a dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet. And the farmers who were suffering terribly economically could not get their grievances met or have any attention paid to them. And it was a dictatorship. They had tried some low-level terrorism against the Pinochet government. So what they wanted to do was get other countries involved. So what they did was they poisoned this fruit. The FDA did inspections in Philadelphia, and 80% of Chilean fruit came into Philadelphia. They opened, the FDA inspectors opened some boxes, and lo and behold, there on practically the very first box, there is some discolored grapes. They did an analysis, and there were very low levels of cyanide in the grapes, and the packing had been tampered with. Well, because Philadelphia was the port for 80% of Chilean fruit, it was fairly easy to intercept and stop. They increased their inspections from like 1% of the shipments to 5%. There was a recall of Chilean fruit all across the country. Pinochet himself, to combat this, went down to the Chilean docks and ate a whole bunch of grapes to show how safe they were. But about 100 Chilean growers went out of business as a result of this. It did hurt their trade pretty significantly. But then again, there has not been an instance of that kind of poisoning since then, certainly from that source, and of course Chile today is a democracy. But these were two instances of modern agricultural terrorism. Now, domestically, this is probably one of the more interesting cases of agroterrorism. And it's not quite agroterrorism because it wasn't directed against livestock or crops in the field. It was directed against salad bars, and it was directed in Wasco County, Oregon. There was a cult, and it was led by someone named Sri Bhagwan Rajneesh, and he and his followers settled in a town called Antelope in Wasco County, and there was a lot of friction with the locals. They were very strange. He was a big sex guru. He had a fleet of Rolls Royces. He used to review his followers. But in September of 1984, people started getting sick in Wasco County. It was very strange. The authorities started looking at it. They started investigating, and all these people had eaten in restaurants around there, and specifically they had used the salad bars. And it took time, to follow this chain of evidence and figure this out. They were able to contact them because in those days, when you signed a credit card bill, you also gave your phone number, so they were able to reach everybody. But there was this sickness. It lasted about a month. Nobody died. They thought maybe it was cheese. The immigrants were making cheese, and maybe it wasn't subject to inspection and it was spoiled or something. Couldn't figure it out. It would seem to be salmonella poisoning. A year later, they arrested the mayor of Rajneeshpuram, which was the Rajneesh's town. There had been a very, very hotly contested election in Wasco County right about the time that these sicknesses broke out. What was happening was the Rajneeshis were trying to take over the county. They did everything they could to influence this election. They brought in homeless people. They brought in, other Rajneeshis who would settle there and vote in the election. What they also did was they had poisoned the salad bars with salmonella, and the idea was to make people sick enough that it would affect the election base, and they would win the election. This was the concept. And the way they got the salmonella, interestingly enough, was Rajneeshpuram opened a clinic. Well, as a clinic, they simply ordered salmonella from a laboratory supply company and shipped it right on, and then they poured it on the salad bars. By the way, it didn't work. They lost the election, and there was an investigation into election fraud, which is what revealed what had actually happened. Though it's kind of disturbing that it took a year to realize that this was the cause of that salmonella outbreak. Ultimately, a number of people went to jail, and the Rajneesh himself was kicked out of the country on immigration charges. They couldn't connect him directly to the poisoning. But he was sent off to India, changed his name to Osho, and ultimately the cult followed him to India, so they're not even here anymore. But that was the most direct case of, not, like I said, not agroterrorism, but terrorism against foodstuffs that we have. Now, those are those particular instances. And when I was asked to speak here, I tried to start thinking, what are the hazards that face, from a terrorist standpoint, our food supply today? So, you look at the various groups. You look at the eco-extremists, Animal Liberation Front. Well, they haven't been very active in a long, long time. And they mostly went after installations. Their last activities were in the early part of this decade. Earth Liberation Front, or Earth First, what are they doing? They're spiking trees. They're burning down housing developments. Their big thing is urban sprawl, so they don't like infrastructure. They don't like that. But they don't seem to attack livestock. They don't attack foodstuffs. All these pro-animal groups, I don't believe would kill animals. If you look on the other side, domestically, the militias and so forth, they blow things up. They don't like government installations, and that gave us Oklahoma City. If you look abroad to the Middle East, I have to say that I kind of find it hard to believe that Osama bin Laden, hiding out in a cave in Pakistan, is plotting against American livestock. I don't think that's uppermost in his mind right now, or that of any of his Confederates. So, you can always be wrong about these things, but we seem to be fairly safe on that count. Then you look at potential cults. You had the Rajneeshis that we saw just a moment ago, and there have been other cults that have conducted terrorist operations, most notably Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, where they released poison gas on the Tokyo subway in 1995, killed a lot of people. And the thing about cults is they operate on such a bizarre basis in such a different universe that you can't anticipate their actions. Very, very difficult to figure out. You had, of course, the People's Temple and Jim Jones in Guyana, but, that was, he killed a congressman and then they all killed themselves. So could some cult that we don't know, that I've never heard of, that's out there somewhere in the hinterlands, poison livestock or try to attack our food supply? It's certainly possible. The cult movement doesn't seem to be very active these days, but I could always be wrong about that. There is a terrorist that I worry about, and agroterrorism and food terrorism does worry me much more than some of the more spectacular threats that we talk about, like nuclear terrorism or radiological terrorism. And there is, I believe, a profile of a terrorist that could conceivably attack our food supply. And I imagine him as the ranch hand who got fired 2 weeks ago. The guy on the ranch showed up for work. He was always drunk. He'd disappear for days or weeks at a time. He broke the equipment. Finally he just had to be fired. You had to get rid of this guy. In the old days, someone like this would have gotten fired. He would have gone home. He would have knocked off a fifth of whiskey. He would have gotten in a barroom fight. He would have wrapped his truck around a tree, and that more or less would have been the end of it. Nowadays, maybe he'll go home. He'll get his grandpappy's 45 and show up at the front office the next morning, and that's a possibility. Or he could find some 6-month-old piece of sausage in the back of his refrigerator, rub it in a little dirt or feces or something, go back to the ranch where he got fired and toss it into the feed bin. That scares me. And if he's sufficiently conscious, he could do it in several places. There is a lot of vulnerability in the agricultural industry. And as I looked at the spectrum of hazards and tried to think them through, it strikes me that the greater threat is from within the industry. And the reason for this is that the kind of person who would do this sort of thing would know the industry, would know the system, would know the vulnerabilities, would probably work with animals or with livestock, would have a grudge of some kind, and might use that knowledge and have some idea of the consequences of what he's doing at some level. There is a precedence for this, or a precedent, and that is in 1996, when police in Berlin, Wisconsin got a phone call from some unnamed person who said that there was a company called National Byproducts, Inc. that had pesticide in its feed. The National Byproducts, Inc. supplied Purina. So the police and the Wisconsin authorities go over to National Byproducts and tallow at the factory. Well, Purina withheld a shipment of 300 tons of animal feed that was going to the upper Midwest the next day. And there was an investigation. It took 2 years, but there was finally an indictment, and it was someone from a competing feed manufacturer who was trying to put this particular company out of business. And this person was indicted and imprisoned. But that's what I mean about internal kinds of threats. And, you know, when you look at this kind of threat or this kind of hazard, all the magnetometers in the world and all the screening machines are not going to guard against it. I mean, the only thing you can do is be vigilant and be aware that there are these vulnerabilities, that there is the possibility that someone, for whatever reason, might do something that would harm the feed of our livestock, harm the livestock themselves, try to create some kind of an incident that could harm the animal agricultural industry, and do harm to it, and would, you know, an incident like that in the future would also give ammunition to people who are criticizing the industry today from the outside. So vigilance is the ultimate protective weapon. It's true for Homeland Security across the board. It's true for the animal agricultural industry. And it's just something to keep in mind as we go about our business and as we look at our food supply, as we look at the handling of our livestock and our, you know, the food that we serve to the public. This is something to keep in mind. Vigilance, basic precautions, some sense of protection and safety is really, truly the best defense, better than anything that Homeland Security or the government can do. It really has to happen at grassroots. It has to happen at grassroots in all cases, everything from travel to agriculture. And if there is any one message I would leave you with, it is simply that. Just be conscious that there are hazards out there and bad people, and you can't even take your back for granted.